to another blog by Ariane Brito analysis. Today, 6th of April 2026, we are catching up with our annual lecture published last year in December 2025. At the time, not only revised the Ariane question, but we also analyzed the United States bombing in terrorist sites in Nigeria. We laid the agenda for 2026, and we discussed whether the United States had a US Centric economic policy to be laid down in the G20 taking place now in Miami in December 2026. I dropped a link in my post. I hope you have a chance to click on the link. It's an article that was published in 2025 in December, in the tradition of the last year's publications, annual publications in Brito analysis blog. We always have the tradition of recapping the podcasts at the end of the year and laying out the new plans for the following year. It gave me a great pleasure to transition from Ariane Brito analysis to Ariane Craft's analysis, and the publications done in this sense really marked a change in my blog. Now we have new events that we were not quite expecting when we published our annual lecture in 2025, namely the Iran incursion at the United States bombing of Iran and the Strait of Hormuz crisis. However, we wanted to catch up on our published lecture of 2025 and to discuss the US Centric 2026 agenda for the G20 Summit. If you could please click on that link, we'll take you to the annual lecture, Ariane Craft's analysis. We discussed the ISIS neo-imperialism in the context of Africa. We discussed how channels that were produced and built via diplomatic channels and then via infrastructure channels from Nigeria to Turkey and North Africa went from illicit trade channels to human trafficking channels. We discussed the transactional diplomacy that was a tremendous scandal that still rocks many of our communities all across Europe and Africa, which was a scandal of Libya's former leader, Gaddafi, involvement with the extreme right leader of France, Sarkozy, the former president of France, Sarkozy. That scandal made us question if all leaders of the third world are like that. They say one thing, they round up several countries against the West, and they are yet working for the extreme right of Europe. That is something we do not want to wish to know, because it's truly sickening and revolting, the level of corruption and self-grandeurs that people that are involved in politics can have at the expense of Africans and Europeans alike. Gaddafi is one among many, but the fact that Gaddafi had a tremendous role in founding African Union, in herding leaders against the West, and yet he was completely involved and initiated to the extreme racist right of France, make us question how sickening politics can be from that point of view. However, not all African leaders, not all European leaders, not not all leaders of the world are like that. So we still have hope for present and future. Is there any terms of detecting transactional diplomacy at the level of Iran, at the level of the United States, at the level of Arab and African countries? Well, those terms will never be quite clear. However, in my lecture, a blog lecture in 2025, I proposed a series of measures that could be adopted to reduce this, and one of them is the transparent database of all oil and mineral deals, of exploitation of natural resources in Africa and certain parts of the Middle East. We will get there in a bit. For now, I want you to click on the link. We went to the Sarkozy and Gaddafi scandal. In our annual lecture, we go in detail in the ISIS neo-imperialism tactics and actions in Africa. We gave you a historical background to how the ideology and later theology formed in African countries, and is vital to understand the influence of ISIS there today. We discussed the militant side of the question, and we also proposed certain measures to be adopted in the G20. And this has to be done by all of us, people who are not involved in international organizations, are not politicians, but who believe that enough is enough and we can trust politicians and leaders for all our lives. But that doesn't mean that the civil society doesn't also have responsibility to engage in community discussions and pay attention to what is going on for the sake of all of us and safety as well. When we discussed the Sarkozy and Gaddafi transactional diplomacy, and it's clear that those producing refugees in Africa and the Middle East are clearly involved with the extreme right. We raised questions if this feature of evilness is among us all, if these extreme Islamic leaders are up to their neck with these extreme right leaders to the detriment of all of us. We arrived to the conclusion that there's evidence that has been presented at the court levels and at international organizations that they produced the extremists produced the refugees, destroyed the infrastructures, that there's a need for to cap the exploitation of natural resources from Africa to places like Turkey for transformation. We gave the example of leather, that a cow skin, goat skin shouldn't be exported to Turkey, would highly help to reduce terrorism in Africa, extremism, if the natural resources of the country were developed, were transformed in the country, so it kept the export of national resources from Africa. Likewise, would highly help if groups like Sarkozy wouldn't have access to universities and students who come from Africa and rich countries and are clearly involved in this and such scheme, and later go back to Africa and own a monopoly of production and simply partner with European races which are very little compared to the majority population, to the benefit of these groups at the expenses of European populations and African populations. As I told you several times, I was born in Cape Verde, and my family is in their they descend from certain families. I am lucky not to descend from Portuguese settlers, I must say that, because we don't have, we never crucify Jews. I did it in my island a few centuries ago. We never lynched people in there like Indians done. So we could observe things, and one thing that my cousins are saying, and my mother said, is that we have people who studied in Portugal and are politicians, who go to Portugal, make these friendships with politicians, and then take lands that were supposed to be from the Scottish descendant families, from the Spaniard Jewish descendant families, and give them to Portuguese politicians who nothing have to do with Jewish or people who has been there, who have been in these particular islands, not because they wanted, but because they were kicked out and treated like animals by Spanish populations and the authorities. So if you have this level of corruption in Cape Verde, you have this level of corruption in other countries in higher levels. And to be quite frank, I think that only help would have at the level of digging and kicking out this corruption of Cape Verde and other countries would be to drop, first of all, to see if we could seek a uniformity of the English language. I believe that Portuguese, Francophone countries should adopt the English language and seek paritative policies with the Commonwealth and the United States. Is it because I'm advocating for a US Centric approach? It's not. It's simply because Africa is in a despairing state of conflicts, of exploitation of minerals, of exploitation of oils, of mines, just like in Afghanistan, mines on the floor, bombing children's legs up. All over Africa, they still have residual mines in Angola, they still planting mines in new minerals. And it's my true belief that we need a country that has a policy that wants nothing to do with the natural resources of Africa. And it seems to me that the US Centric agenda of 2026 G20 is the best option. And is the best option to curb corruption and to curb nepotism that is created by tiny racist politicians in Portugal, in France, that don't want to work for the European public, but are okay at creating migrants and refugees, are okay at creating migrant crises, as long as they can play military, they can play police, they can play authorities at the expense of not doing nothing and persecuting those vulnerable and enriching at the expenses of African resources. And that is pretty disgusting, especially considering the level of poverty and misery of colonies in Africa. Now, would the English language only in itself, adopting English language in itself, help to achieve this line where corruption will be easily extracted from African countries? No, because we are not advocating we are not advocating military campaigns like Secretary Hillary Clinton did in Africa that led to the elimination of Gaddafi. And at the time she was punished for that at the media level. And many persons, inclusive, who were not aware of the Sarkozy scandal that would flourish months later, we were not aware of the level of corruption and the spies that men had for the African nations, Gaddafi had, and the exploitative intentions he had in relation to Africa, Black Africa, let's speak frankly. We were not aware of all of that. And we chastised Secretary Hillary Clinton. But at the end of the day, we found out that she made a tremendous favor to Africa. Unfortunately, by then, we already had militants and Islamists flourishing in Africa at courtesy of Gaddafi and their own allies. This negative impact in African politics and African lives that's leading to mass migration in Europe and the United States can be curbed if we have a language, a transparency, a uniformity in language all of Africa, that we can communicate clearly and at the same level and know each other's realities. Because perhaps if they were speaking English language in Libya and in other Francophone countries, Nigeria and other powerful countries would be aware of the level of corruption and exploitation that was happening in Francophone countries. And today Senegal would still be a beautiful country. Cote d'Ivoire would still be a beautiful, successful country. So if we allow a lack of communication between different African nations to be a barrier to knowing the extent of partnerships, of transactional diplomacy between extreme rights groups and African countries that have quite a deal of influence in Africa and access to minerals of other people's countries, access to diamonds, access to the supply chain, then we are doing a disfavor to the future generations. Hence why I wrote this annual lecture advocating for a change in the way the contracts are dished out in Africa and certain countries of the Middle East. Oil exploitation contracts, diamonds, minerals exploitation contracts. Everyone should have access online. Whether you're a child in school in Morocco or whether you're a teenage in school in Libya or Nigeria or Cape Verde or any other, Mozambique for example, you should be able to access the internet and look for the oil exploitation contracts that are taking place in any country of Africa that involve European countries. You should be able to access the level, the number of contracts of uranium and all minerals in Africa, anywhere from Africa. There should be a transparency level that the civil society also has access, and there should be a transparency level that anyone in the world also has access. You might say, I don't like English language, I'll prefer Spanish. Not everyone speaks Spanish. And there are more supply chains associated with the English language. And therefore, when someone is having access to this level of contracts and to this level of transparency, the young people all over Africa, they are bordering their worldviews. They're coming up with ideas, with innovations. They're aware of the trade that's taking place in several different countries of Africa and the exploitation of resources. And undoubtedly, they will be more aware of ways of bringing modernity and environmental questions to Africa. Academic leaders of African descent for the last decade have pushed, especially in Britain, for transparency in the exploitation of oils from an environment perspective. Namely, they want countries like China to stop using and exploiting and facilitating the exploitation of shale oil in inhumane and archaic manner in several points of Africa. This inhumane and archaic manner jeopardizes the local population's lives. And not surprising, in certain places of Nigeria, Angola, etc., you will see the locals using their water, and water is completely black, covered in oil. The population is desperate. There's bandits everywhere, there's crime everywhere, pushing for people to move to Europe. So the best way to bring a standardized platform in Africa and the Middle East is to have a common language and a digital access to all exploitation contracts. Is this something, an idea that I'm having is completely bonkers? No. Look at what is being called US Centric plan for G20 plan for exploitation of international sources. The United States is proposing to modernize the international supply chain, especially the exploitation of resources side of the equation. Is proposing introduction of AI, and is proposing to make it easy to drop all these bureaucratic barriers for fast trade. South Africa is not being invited, might not attend, but many of the countries want to be there. Poland will be there, and other countries who will be having a central role in the matter, considering that South Africa has way more resources than Poland and contributed way more financially to the richness of Europe, with Poland always taking when stopped sucking off USSR, start sucking off the European Union funds. We have to ask, is that fair that South Africa, who contributed so much to the Commonwealth, to financially at the level of colonialism, during slavery prior to colonialism, is it fair that he's being excluded? However, there's the issue of human rights in South Africa, and what President Trump and his administration labeled a human rights crisis, humanitarian crisis, which is affecting the white populations, white farmers in South Africa. Now, is this to say that the other African countries cannot have a word in this summit? No. That is why activism is very important. Activism from the civil society, activism for all the groups. So either if you're a mom who's caring for the children or doing other things like me, or whether you are someone who has a full-time job, or who's an engineer, or an artist, or whatever you're doing, let's do something together. Let's make sure that you are joining an organization, that you're campaigning at the civil level. If you're protesting, let me know. So far I only know what usually the extreme left groups do. I know the Communist Party will definitely be protesting. I don't know any other groups that are planning protests, but what about action? Are you pushing for an agenda? Would you consider partnering with me to push the agenda that I'm bringing forward? If so, click on the link, my annual lecture, and what I propose for 2026 campaign for the G20. Activism to the max. Let's push this agenda to the max and bring people and organizations in civil society, organizations, agencies, and individuals who truly want to push the agenda for a new world order. Thank you, and speak to you soon. Bye-bye.